Hello, everybody, and welcome to our new episode of Occulted. I'm so glad to be here with you today. So, today we are going to explore whether or not celebrities are out there portraying themselves as the Whore of Babylon on concerts mainly or TV. We're going to get into that symbology, and then we're going to close out our discussion today on whether or not OnlyFans is actually black magic, black techno sex magic. Okay. So that's what we're going to get into today. So many of you, after the last Katy Perry episode of her portraying herself as this Babylonian goddess, so many of you tagged me and messaged me about pretty much all different celebrities from Hollywood to music to everything you can think of, just Instagram, whatever it is, of apparently portraying themselves as the Whore of Babylon. Okay, and so prior, we did look at this image here. So this is Katy Perry basically displaying herself as a Babylonian goddess, but this can also be looked at as an image of the Whore of Babylon as well. And many people do consider that. But I also was sent this image, and this is actually Lady Gaga. And what's interesting here is some people who are analyzing her concerts believed that this was actually the same sort of image, except rather than seeing the beast portrayed as an animal, as we move into our period, the beast portrays itself as a robot. And so the beast nature in our era is more cyborg imagery. It's more robot imagery. And we got into this earlier with Katy Perry as the sort of the space cyborg goddess as well. So here's another one as well. This is another image that many people believed was sort of Katy Perry, Lady Gaga showing herself to be a image of the Whore of Babylon. And the picture actually on the right does look very similar to Metropolis, actually. This is the Whore of Babylon in Metropolis. And so this is all with the arm raised there. This is all very similar imagery. Okay, so let's look at some classical imagery of the Whore of Babylon here. So different painters and sort of biblical scholars have also portrayed her. That is William Blake. That's pretty famous, that one. And here is another image of how she is classically portrayed. And so, of course, this image comes from Revelation and John's apocalyptic vision of sort of the end of the world. And I'm going to now read to you exactly what John says about the Whore of Babylon in his apocalyptic vision. He says, "And there came one of the seven angels, which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying, Come unto me, come hither. I will shew unto thee a judgment of the great whore that sitteth on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. She carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with blood of saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 mountains of which the woman sitteth. So that's a little small piece of where she is mentioned in Revelation, just to give you an image of the purple and the scarlet. She's often portrayed as having purple and scarlet, which I think is why people were sending me also this imagery of Gaga here as well. And here's this imagery again. There. So there's lots of different ways that we can sort of enter into this conversation, but I really want to focus on one concept, which is the idea that at the time of the apocalypse, or at the time of the end of the earth, something very specific is happening to humanity and is happening to the planet. And that is that it actually bifurcates and it actually splits into two different streams, or 2 different globes, if you will. And that's what John is talking about when he says he sees New Jerusalem descending. This is, the heavens, this is the higher sort of raptured earth. But as that one bores down upon us and is coming, there's also a sort of dross and a lower earth that is full of the abominations and everything that's unholy that could really not be purified. That then goes into be what is sometimes called the Mula Prakriti in the Eastern mysteries. It's the chaotic abyss, and it goes into a lower substrate. So at the end of any development, we have this higher path that emerges, which is called New Jerusalem. And in the New Age, this is kind of also called the New Earth, or the 5D Earth. It's the same concept, but given a sort of New Age scientific language. In anthroposophy, it's called New Jupiter. And Rudolf Steiner uses the cosmological term for that, which is Jupiter. Jerusalem is Jupiter. So the lower earth then is this sort of, it really is the dross of this earth and what could not be transformed, what could not be made whole through Christ. That all turns downward and becomes a chaotic substrate that becomes a different world, if you will. All right, and that is how the earth actually evolves. So you have one stream that is really the spiritualizing stream, right? That's represented by heaven and New Jerusalem. That's evolving, that's evolution, okay? And then you have a devolving stream, or a descending stream, that is sort of regressing in a way. You could see it that way. And as a symbol of this, we have the feminine consciousness also splitting in 2. Okay, we have the lower portion of the earth that is full of the abominations. That is represented by the whore, okay? That's represented by the whore of Babylon in Revelation, and the whore. Now, the higher earth, that is represented by another figure in Revelation. Can you guess who? It is the lady clothed in the sun lady, okay? The woman clothed in the sun. She represents the divine Sophia and the higher part of the earth. Another way that occultists will sometimes view this is you have the lower Eve, which is sort of the lower earth, the lower substrate that will be turned into a sort of a lower kingdom of life from the dross. So you have an Eve essentially, and an earth that is made of that, which is regressive. And then you have an Eve that is also the new, representing sort of the new consciousness, the soul that goes into the higher world. So you can kind of also see it as 2 Eves, as 2 earths, as 2 women, because women in occult science are always matter. They're always the denser of the elements. So when they talk about the whore of Babylon, they're also talking about this lower earth if you will, this lower realm that's forming. And then there's the higher one, which is represented by the woman who is, bearing the son. And of course, she's in Revelation, she's in labor, and she's giving birth to the new impulse of evolution for the world, the new son. Okay. So this is how we can look at the whore of Babylon and contrast her with the idea of the true Sophia, because I see all the time this flattening of feminine spirituality where all female figures are the same. And there isn't a real deep understanding of the dark aspect of the feminine. Every feminine aspect is seen as sort of equal or the same, and there isn't a real deep understanding about the inversion of feminine consciousness and what is meant by the whore of Babylon, specifically in John's work. So let's get a little bit deeper into this and into the whore and the idea of the devolution of humanity and why she represents that. So I want to be clear that this isn't just talking about women. You sometimes hear people who are very deeply entrenched in dogma and they automatically think it's just about females. No, every single person has a male aspect in their consciousness and a female aspect of their consciousness. Everyone's soul is ordered that way. Okay. So this is like the anima and I think animus, that concept. All right. So you can't escape this idea. Okay. So the whore really represents regression into an animal state, into an animal condition. She represents the human soul that is in the condition of kama manas. So in the Eastern tradition, you might say kama manas is what the whore of Babylon really is. It's the unrefined, pure impulses of the human being that have not yet been drawn into the heart, have not yet been drawn into the mind, and is completely unconscious. So there's no refinement of the impulses that happen it's just following it, which is associated with being an animal. So it's sort of like your lower animal self, your lower urges are uncontrolled and you're totally ruled by your lower chakras, your lower centers. So what it also represents in the way of sort of occult practices is that anything that would be from what is considered the lunar era. So in occultism, the lunar era is sort of all of the practices that really appear before Christ. And the idea is that these lunar practices have a much different character and they're missing the initiating quality that the Christ impulse brings. And so the practices before the incarnation of Christ are very different than we see after the incarnation of Christ. And so that Babylonian tradition often turns into an inversion of what would be considered Christian esoterica and the actual initiating impulse of our era. And if you stay in this lunar impulse, it's not good for your spirit because you're staying trapped in past, you could say, you're staying trapped in a past consciousness that is deteriorating and in a death spiral. And that is a force that can pull you downward. As time progresses, epoch after epoch after epoch, humanity is called to evolve and integrate the consciousness that comes forth for the time. So every time there's a shift in the epoch and a new civilization rises and falls and time evolves, we are challenged to find the impulse of the age and develop according to that impulse. And when that cannot happen, it is as though people stay asleep and they begin to regress because, People will often say, oh, well, the oldest spiritual traditions are the most true, they're the most pure. But that's not actually an accurate way to look at earlier periods of worship. You have to look at it as a progression, and that the period of paganism, okay, had a very specific impulse, and something was being brought forward and developed for man in that period. And then that reaches a peak, it falls into decadence, and then there's another period that comes in. And it's very important to move with that flow and move with that initiating impulse, which is always the initiating impulse or the Christ impulse, no matter what portion of earthly development you're in. All right. So in that way, what we would consider evil is really the qualities of a past era that assert themselves as truth today. So evil in the truest sense of what it is really the qualities of the past and the sort of images of the past that try to assert themselves as truth today when it's out of time. And that's really what evil is. It forms a kind of darkness. It's a lack of light. So the horror is any person, could be male or female, that is completely controlled by the material world and their lower impulses when the call is to spiritualize. The whore rejects or does not understand the spiritual and therefore remains in a transactional, materialist, and codependent worldview. Okay. All right. The other thing that I've noticed when it comes to analyzing the Whore of Babylon is that a lot of people will confuse psychology and the discussions about mind and the mental plane with spirituality. So psychologists will take the Whore of Babylon, right? And they'll say that this is actually a symbol of liberation for women. This is a symbol of freedom of women. And this is a symbol of overcoming the patriarchy and of going against a negative order. You know, it's sort of like a symbol against toxic masculinity. And then you get sort of these groups that think that behaving in a hypersexual manner is freedom and it is liberty, right? So the Whore of Babylon is not a psychological concept. It's an entity. It's an actual spiritual entity that we experience as a very real impulse. So I see this a lot in modern conversations today in the podcast circuit is people who are psychologists, say like a Jordan Peterson type, who will come into spirituality and religion and not really acknowledge that the spiritual world objectively exists or that God objectively exists. And so it's as though psychology in the area of mind and analysis is being portrayed as spiritual, as a spiritual thought. But psychology can lead someone to spiritual experiences, perhaps, but the arena of the mind and psychology is not spirituality. These are different things, okay? So just keep that in mind. And again, it's not that we should view old goddesses, even the Babylonian goddesses, as bad or as automatically evil. Okay, we don't need to look at Ishtar or Inanna or any of the even earlier goddess figures that we see, Venus. We don't need to look at that and see, oh, that's evil. The real way to enter into this imagery and this concept is to understand the goddess and the feminine imagery for what she represents at that time for humanity and compare it to today. Okay, so old goddesses need not be seen as evil but rather through the lens of their time and the consciousness humanity held when they created that image. Okay? So we're not trying to say, especially in Christian esotericism, we're not trying to say that everything before the incarnation of Christ is automatically evil or negative. I disagree, and I think that's lazy thinking, and I think that that's just sloppy analysis. I think we need to enter into those things and say why, what was the meaning of that? Where was human consciousness at that time to project that image? What is the sort of neutral, what is the negative, and come in it very, very holistically. All right. So this is another image of the Whore of Babylon, and a lot of people see this person. We're going to look at an image of Madonna. A lot of people believe that Madonna's entire career is basically to invert the image of the goddess, basically, or to bring forward the image of the whore and to really create rituals around that visual and that energy in her concerts. And so here is one example of that. And by the way, I'm not trying to say that this person, Lady Gaga or Madonna, is absolutely doing this herself, or that this is exactly what they're doing. I don't know. All I can do is look at the symbology and get a feel for it, and we can talk about it. That it's okay, we should talk about it. But I'm not saying for sure or anything like that, or trying to paint a picture. It's very possible that these are things that you have to do if you want to be in the music industry, or if you want to be an actress, or you want to get to a certain level. It's very possible that this is a sort of initiation that you have to agree to. And there's been so many stories of people coming forward that this could be the case. So here's an image of Madonna, and this is her reinvention tour. And this is her, and she's wearing scarlet and purple, just like the passage that we read at the top of the show. And this is actually from the promotion that she would play before she would go and perform. And you'll notice that there is a dog in the image here. And this is actually a very occult thing to have, because the dog, which could be Anubis, is the bringer of the soul into the underworld. And so oftentimes in occult rites, you'll see a representation of Anubis, of the dog, of the hellhound, that is said to bring the soul into the underworld. And if you watched my moon lecture a few weeks ago, the black dog is also Zotl in the Mesoamerican tradition. Okay. You'll also notice that it was also called the beast within, and I think she also quotes Revelation when she's doing this. So she's quoting Revelation on her tour. She's dressing as the Scarlet Woman, and she's calling it the beast within, and she's actually using very, very overt occult images. She's even simulating vomiting as well. You can see her in that image, and she's sticking her finger down her throat. And now what ends up happening in these circles where the feminine becomes the whore. So in dark occultism, it's very easy to tell when somebody is practicing black magic, because the feminine aspect is always the whore. It's like, that's what you have to be. That is the feminine negative polarity in occult rituals, is you are the whore. You dress as the whore, you're the Scarlet Woman. And how typically this system works is it is obsessed with the idea of purging and catharsis. So how the feeling of euphoria works is just sheer connection to Lucifer. They just want freedom. They just want euphoria. And there isn't really a deeper understanding about attunement. It's just about purging. It's just about feeling free. And there's no real concept of, okay, well, once you experience catharsis, once you release, once you express yourself, now it's time for attunement. Now you have to attune to God. That's the whole point of purging. That's the whole point of catharsis. That's the whole point of doing anything that feels like a release to you. But in black magic, it is purely and mainly about feeling release and ecstatic process and just purely expressing something. If you have something within you that is in pain or trouble, you just have to express it. You just have to release it. You just have to let it go. And then you're powerful. But the problem is that if you just keep doing this again and again, and all you do is just operate in this constant catharsis and you're not attuning yourself, you're basically just worshiping your lower centers. You're just basically trying to purge, and you're just recirculating all of your stuff, because it's the attunement, okay, of the heart with God, with Christ, that actually evolves the human being, which is the whole point. Okay, so that is often why you'll see these bizarre, like art installations that are just someone literally vomiting their trauma, their feelings, their whatever, and it never comes full circle into healing. It never comes full circle into creation. It just ends up staying this sort of degenerate thing, because the impulse of Christ and the impulse of God is not filling that place that was created within the individual by expressing their pain. And so you get these groups of people who are obsessed with creating catharsis, but then they don't create the actual process of initiation afterwards. And that's the difference between black magic in many ways and higher processes of initiation. Higher processes of initiation involve alignment, and they involve attunement. It's not just about releasing all the time. That was fine in the pre-Christ period. Okay, it's different now. And even then, it was never like what I see sometimes happening with this idea of just purging as a spiritual practice, and worshiping that feeling of emptiness after this ecstatic process happens, without bringing in that impulsive initiation afterwards. So that is the whore of Babylon. That is what she represents. She is not really the goddess in the truest sense of the word. She's sort of really the fallen goddess, and the real goddess is the woman clothed in the sun. The real goddess is actually Sophia. And let's see what Revelation says about the woman clothed in the sun. And I'll bring up an image of her as I read this to you. Okay. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to the God and his throne. Okay. So that is the woman clothed in the sun. So this is the image of the true Sophia, and obviously the imagery of being clothed in the Son is saying that she is completely realized with Christ. That's what that means. You know, her etheric body has completely received him as her husband. So she is now the living embodiment of him. Through her, she speaks his wisdom into the world, and she lives his wisdom. Everything about her is an expression of Christ. So Sophia, the true Sophia, is birthing the new impulse or the new earth or new Jerusalem, and the impulse that brings that through in the world. And her consciousness is, you know, the base consciousness and the starting point of the new earth. And in anthroposophy, this is New Jerusalem. And of course, New Jupiter, excuse me. And so Sophia is the wisdom of Christ. She is Anthroposophia, and she is the true feminine life. She is the true feminine archetype. That's what we strive to. And so to compare the two, if Sophia is living wisdom, then the whore is deathly ignorant. And this is the reality with the image of the whore is completely unconscious. She's actually completely unaware of the spiritual world. And she's totally controlled by the material world. Everything is transactional to her. Everything meaningful to her is transactional. And there isn't a place yet for spirit inside of her. So Sophia also is the Holy Spirit. And you could also say that the idea of the divine feminine, the idea of the anima, is also the human soul. It's the human soul. And in order for the human soul to evolve and grow, it has to go through something called catharsis. And catharsis is basically a purification. So the idea is that we are full of all kinds of thoughts and feelings and emotions and impulses that are beneath us, that don't represent our highest good, our highest self. And we have to go through this process of catharsis, which is this purging and fasting and realization and attunement that purifies our spiritual bodies. And that actually leads to immortality. And I have several lectures on this, but one is called The Immortal Body, and there's another one as well. I'll put them in the description below that describe exactly this process of catharsis. But the idea of the feminine crowned in the sun is also the human soul that has completely gone through catharsis and is purified. And in the anthroposophical system, when the human soul becomes purified, this brings about the new earth, the new Jupiter, the new Jerusalem, and the human being operates from a place of initiation that is called spirit self or pure manas in the East. So you actually have a different way of operating, and the astral body becomes totally purified at that point. Okay. So the woman also symbolizes the soul. And so the whore of Babylon symbolizes a soul that is impure, that is kama manas, that is unpurified. And then the woman clothed in the sun is the purified human soul. That's what we're seeing there as well. And I want to also read to you this piece from Rudolf Steiner, who describes how Sophia really is connected with the Christ. And I think that sometimes people can get a little caught up in, I think, dogmatic ideas about Christ, and there's no room to expand. And so I think that this is a very good description here. And this is from GA 202, The Search for the New Isis, Divine Sophia. We must realize that through the force of the Christ, we can find an inner astronomy which reveals to us more the origin and life of the cosmos as grounded in the force of the Spirit. And then we have this insight into the cosmos, awakened through the newly found power of Isis, which is now become the power of the divine Sophia. Then will the Christ, who has united with the earth since the mystery of Golgotha or the crucifixion, become active within us, because then we shall know him. It is not the Christ we lack, my dear friends, but the knowledge and wisdom of the Christ, the Sophia of the Christ, the Isis of the Christ. I'm going to read that one more time, because when you are dealing with Sophia, when we're dealing with Mary, the divine feminine, it is not at all at odds with Christ, or it's not competing. It's not, they go together like hand and glove. It is not the Christ we lack, my dear friends, but the knowledge and wisdom of the Christ, the Sophia of the Christ, the Isis of the Christ. So New Jerusalem is populated with a humanity that understands the wisdom of Christ, the Sophia of Christ, lives the wisdom of Christ. It becomes a way in which you operate. And that is called anthroposophia as well. So that's the real mystery of the feminine right there. Okay, so who is the whore? The whore of Babylon is someone, male or female, who does not understand the spiritual function and power of their sexual centers, and therefore channels their sexual forces into activities that harm themselves and others. Here, fornication is not just referring to sex. Fornication can also be seen as alchemy. It is either the raising of one's consciousness to the realms, to higher realms through the heart, or it is the lowering of themselves into the subnatural forms and conditions through the whore. The female aspect of all people that demands the lower urges be maintained until the human being lowers to an animal once again. The feminine, the matter, the stone, is always what it's being, is the feminine aspect, the matter, the stone, is always what's being transformed into the grail. It is the woman who wears the mineral world as her robe and invites all life into it. At the end of every epoch, the feminine consciousness splits in two. This bifurcation of the earth, this is the bifurcation of the earth and the two streams of man, and each person must choose their path. Okay, now this idea of the earth splitting, into, of humanity splitting into, New Jerusalem, of higher earth, of a lower earth, this is very reminiscent of the idea of the doppelgänger, of this story about how people have an identical aspect that's often shown as evil. And this is also revealing a deep secret about the separation of the two streams, the separation of the earth, one that's higher and holy, and then one that is lower. And this has been portrayed again as the splitting of feminine consciousness into like two Eves. Okay, and let's look at some images of this. So the most, I think, probably the earliest one that we see is definitely the metropolis imagery that we looked at in our last one. But you can also see, I'll just bring that up here. So in that image there, on the left-hand side, that is an exact image of the creation, basically, of a doppelganger. You have the goddess Mary or Sophia there, and she's encapsulated in this sort of coffin thing. And then you have her essence being literally transferred into a machine, which becomes like her negative doppelganger or her harmonic doppelganger, if you will. So you have this angelic individual and you have this satanic individual, and it's portrayed as a robot. It's portrayed as a cyborg, as though that's what humanity's potential destiny obviously is to get transferred into. And then on the right, you can see Katy Perry repeatedly sort of using this metropolis imagery. And here is Beyonce and Lady Gaga directly using this metropolis imagery. And there were so many more pictures of different people using this imagery of the doppelganger. This is an image of the Whore of Babylon in modern times. In earlier periods, the whore was portrayed as riding the beast, as being reduced to the animal nature. So in earlier periods, it was about kind of regressing into a beast-like state, an animalism. In our time, decadence and regression is turning into a machine, is transhumanism. That is the same thing as in earlier periods regressing into an animal. Regression today is to turn into a machine. And so when we see this, okay, and this stuff, you're just looking at the negative doppelganger, the harmonic doppelganger of the feminine. You're looking at the earth made into a machine, the woman made into a machine, which, by the way, can be completely controlled. People become enslaved when they're in machines, right? So I did receive a fascinating email. And by the way, you guys, if you find anything, you can send me it at ggyoung.com, I think, /occulted tips. And so I was sent an image of Taylor Swift actually directly portraying to her fans the image of the doppelganger, the harmonic doppelganger. So here it is. This is her in her video Fortnite, and it's basically the exact same scene of Maria in Metropolis. And you'll notice here that there's the black dog, okay, in Madonna's portrayal of herself as the beast, as the Whore of Babylon, as the fallen goddess figure. She also had a dog in there. And Taylor is also using a dog. And it is a reality that Anubis, or the black canine-ish god of Egypt, is often the first thing we see, or it is in occult rites in order to bring the initiate into the underworld. And so this is a very occult image, really. And this is Katy Perry here as well on the same image. And why is it? Why is it that all pop stars have to do all of these different videos and concerts where a huge portion of their identity has to be to portray the Maria from Metropolis or the Whore of Babylon or the new incarnation of the Whore of Babylon, which is a cyborg woman? Why do they have to do that? You know, it's, and this is, I think, this, I think, was Madonna's attempt at becoming a cyborg. I don't know what happened with this one, but I think this was supposed to be cyborg Madonna. And there's one more of Taylor here that I want to show you. Now, this is Taylor in her video, Ready for It. And this exactly portrays the modern cyborg Whore of Babylon imagery. So on the right-hand side, you see her kind of cloaked, and she's staring right at the mechanized version of herself. Okay, this is Metropolis. That's what that is. This is occult imagery. This isn't, I had a good idea for a music video. This is occult imagery, and this is portraying the modernized image of the Whore of Babylon, in which it is no longer an animal that we regress into, but we regress into a transhuman state. There's so much other, as I was saying before, there's so much other imagery that's empowering for women than to show them literally the worst path that humanity could take. Also here, you can see, if you look closely at the bottom right-hand corner there, it says they are burning all of the witches. And she's being struck by a lightning bolt. And that's very fascinating to me because how it's believed that Eve becomes fertilized, or Mary becomes fertilized, is kind of through this idea of parthenogenesis, or the lightning bolts of Zeus are what fertilize virgins to have virgin births and stuff like that. So there's still very Eve, Mary imagery with that. Being struck by lightning is very representative of parthenogenesis as well. So really what they're showing, really, when they're showing a woman as a cyborg, they're really showing the feminine consciousness, which is women, which is the earth, which is nature, becoming completely captured by really the lowest aspect of the male consciousness. That's really what that's showing, or the Mars impulse, the inverted Mars impulse, if you know my work. It's not an empowering image to show. It's basically showing an image of slavery. When you become a robot, especially a sexy robot, you're just showing yourself as like a sex slave, a sexy, this is not a positive image for women, and it is extremely occult imagery. There's no question about that. There's no way that all of these, and there were so many images that I could have chosen from. I just didn't cover Taylor in my last episode, but there's so much of this imagery. And it's on purpose. How could it not be? And so the central culture, the most popular music and imagery for girls and women, is precise occult imagery of the Whore of Babylon, who in our era takes the image of an harmonic doppelgänger, or the spirit of the earth inverted into a robot Eve, a robot Sophia. Again, in earlier periods, decadence was portrayed as animalism, or as a human becoming an animal or riding the beast. However, today, decadence is symbolized by technology and the human becoming a machine. It is time to understand the symbology and redefine our image of the feminine to the true image of Sophia. Okay. The true body and wisdom of the Christ living in the world. That's the real Sophia. So now let's look at this image again that we started on with Gaga. So if humanity's form of decadence is now machinery, is now transhumanism, this kind of makes a lot of sense why people think that this is actually an image of the beast. And this makes sense because it's not just an animal that Katy Perry's on, it's a robot animal. It's a technology. It's a beast, but it's technologicalized, if that's a word. All right, these are all images of the modern image of the Whore of Babylon. I'm sorry to say. I know there's a lot of Swifties out there. right. All right. Okay, let's check to see what you guys have to say so far. Grimes is another, this is a member comment. Grimes is another artist who is into this kind of magic. Yes. So there's so many different, again, there were so many different examples I could have chosen. And it's like, now that you've seen this, now that you've seen, you won't be able to unsee it now, I think. And thank you guys for writing into me and tagging me and all that. That, I just had so much fun going through all of your tips and all of what you were saying. Just amazing. And your comments as well were so brilliant and insightful. I just really enjoyed going through everything that you had to say. Okay, this is from Joseph Tugas. Sophia is also the name of an AI. Yes, there is a robot named Sophia, and she gives speeches at like the World Economic Forum. She goes on Jimmy Fallon, and she's literally a cyborg named Sophia. And so it doesn't get any more plain as day obvious what's going on. And a lot of people are asking, well, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Well, the first part is this. The first part is that we talk about it. The first part is that we say, okay, well, look at this photo. What do you think about this? What do you think about this performance? Do you think that this is, healthy? And we discuss it. And we learn what the symbols mean. We learn how they can be used. And that is the first line of defense. And healing is to just be able to recognize it and understand it. And that actually does so much good for you, because the worst thing that can happen is that you're not aware of this. You don't have a working lexicon, and you just kind of get ushered into the crowd. And you just start following these people and thinking it's cool and absorbing the entities that basically work through them through these rituals. And you just kind of get pulled down into culture rather than truly discovering who you really are and what you really think. So just having the knowledge, just having the wisdom is really the biggest part. It's the greatest protection. Okay, this is a member comment. Technology can definitely serve as an escape, like video games and virtual reality. However, it's still meant to develop. We are meant to develop advanced technologies. It's how they're used that's the problem. Same with social media. You can't blame social media for the ridiculousness that goes on. It's the intentions of the people that make or break the technology. This is a really good point, and I think we have to reiterate this whenever we are critical of technological advancement. It's really not that we can't evolve and have advanced technologies, okay? But we really have to consider who is making these technologies. Why are they creating them? Because if you're starting to get people who are creating these technologies and they have what you could say a different worldview, or sometimes I'll see these different individuals who are creating technologies who have a misanthropic, anti-human worldview. They don't like humanity. Or we just have to consider who it's coming through, because whatever is created, it's going to be in their image, right? So it's about holding these people accountable. But yes, theoretically, we could have all kinds of advanced devices, and it could be very positive, including having a upliftment of the mineral kingdom and certain entities that end up working through technology and occupying technology. It could actually be a very positive experience for them, raising them actually. But it's really about understanding who is creating these technologies, what do they believe to be true, why are they using them? Because when we get these like tech bros, that come out, and it's seems like all they can think about day and night is how to socially engineer society, and they're not coming out and being collaborative with it. They're holding these technologies back for decades in the military industrial complex, different companies, they're privately developing them, and then they're purposefully bringing them forward to gain control of humanity. And they're using technology as a means of total control. And we can't lie about that either. We can't just skim over that and say that technology is completely neutral. Well, it's not neutral when the main people developing it have these kinds of dreams of socially engineering humanity into their own vision rather than coming to humanity and us having a merit-based system and something based in collaboration. So we have to keep that in mind as well. The dream detective symbolism is the language of the subconscious imagination. Exactly. And this is what I think people who laugh at the idea of the occult, they don't understand that the occult is basically working with your subconscious mind, which controls your behavior directly. So that is sort of the most simple way to explain the occult. Okay, I'm going to read a few more out, and then we're going to get into whether or not OnlyFans is sex magic. Okay, this is from PZ. There's such a very interesting essay by Donna Haraway called The Cyborg Manifesto. Very interesting. It talks about feminism, and it really shows some kind of idea about occultism and transhumanism. Yes, well, transhumanism really can be seen as going hand in hand with the complete domination and subjugation of women, as we'll see in this last portion of today's episode. When transhumanism reaches its total peak, it basically seeks to completely control and exploit women and control and exploit the earth, men too. But when it comes to, the idea of totally controlling the birth process with these synthetic wombs, as we talked about many different times, and just totally trying to engineer every different aspect of the earth. Everything has to be a GMO. We have to have satellites surrounding the earth, harvesting every little bit of energy. It's like when consciousness becomes really sick, especially the male or Mars consciousness becomes really sick, it draws humanity too far forward. It becomes too hyper-futuristic. And it just tries to advance through technology and then project itself into technology. So the masculine impulse, when it becomes inverted and sick, becomes hyper-externalist and hyper-futuristic. Rather than going inward, it's going outward. And then when the feminine consciousness becomes sick, it draws humanity not too far forward, but too far backward into a regression, into an animal condition, into a tribal sort of state. And they both are pulling on humanity all the time, and they each has a negative expression. But in particular, we know more about sort of the Whore of Babylon and the regressive effect of the feminine. There's all these explanations of Eve and the fall, and we have a good look at what happens when the feminine falls and things. We don't really have a very good esoteric picture of what happens to the male consciousness when it declines and it inverts. But when you start understanding the idea of Ahriman and even fallen angels, which are male and things like that, then you're starting to get into it. But yes, this is the time where we have to understand the fall of the male consciousness, which is Antichrist. Christ is the pinnacle of masculine consciousness, of the positive impulse of the sun, right, of light. And then you have the Antichrist, which is the anti-version of him, which is the fallen masculine, which is the Mars impulse, which is Ahriman. The idea of Ahriman and anthroposophy. So these are the concepts that we really have to understand today. Okay, Taylor Craig says, why do they all show us? Because it's consent if people follow them. Yeah, I mean, they, you know, we started our last episode with the concept of the mystery play, and that a lot of people who create music, a lot of people who are in the movies, they understand that basically people are going to be in a trance, taking in the movie, listening to the music, and it's just going to go right into their, subconscious mind. And it allows them to do predictive programming with different things, especially in Hollywood, or revelation of the method, it's sometimes called. And it is a certain kind of permission. It's not direct permission, but what does happen to you is if you repeatedly see images of the enslaved feminine, which is the harmonic doppelganger of the feminine, that's what this is. That is the doppelganger of the feminine, the harmonic doppelganger of the feminine. That's an enslaved person. Okay. If you constantly show someone that image over and over and over again, they think, oh, that's normal. That's cool. That's my destiny. I'm going to dress up for that for Halloween. This is the direction that I'm going in because your idol is doing that. And so people begin to accept the concepts behind it because someone that they really admire is doing it. And they're not realizing that the symbolism that they're working with is connected to very sinister things. That's just the reality. It's a way of Pied Pipering people. It's a way of moving the culture in the direction that these occultists clearly want people to move. And I do believe that they just genuinely believe this. When people, are presenting themselves as the whore or doing all this stuff, I think that they believe that. I think that this is their belief system, right? Okay, we're going to do one last comment here, and then I'm going to get into the final portion of our conversation. So Kevin Spencer says, a lot of individuals become the corrupted healer archetype and pose the technology as helpful while attempting to cause harm. That's a good point too. Absolutely. All right, so the last segment today is going to be discussing whether or not OnlyFans is a form of techno sex magic, modern sex magic. And the consideration today is really, how do occult influences work in modern times? Because with the advent of technology, it allows the occult to take different shapes, different forms. It allows people to do occult practices in larger ways than ever before. And it has changed the face of esoterica. It's changed the face of how rituals are practiced, how energy is harvested, how all this happens. Everything's just become so much bigger than, say, a magician doing something in the Middle Ages and like having their staff and their pouch of herbs. And there were certain limitations when you were practicing occultism in, even a few 100 years ago. You were limited by nature. You were limited by, natural things, natural laws. But technology allows people to override nature, override natural laws. And that's what we have to consider. And that's why, the cyborg is the ultimate image of the degenerate, right? That's because it just gets so carried away. Okay. So OnlyFans is a website that has a bunch of different things on it, but it's mainly a site for cam girls or girls who videotape themselves often doing sexual acts for patrons or sometimes for free. And it's become more and more criticized, I would say, over the last several years, with, I would say, more podcasts forming around why this is occurring. But then when you see some of the concerts, that are going on, and, some of the stuff, maybe we've been saturated as women with that imagery. Everything is hypersexualized, and this is, it's like, I think that a lot of women have been brainwashed to see images of themselves as these hypersexual creatures. I think that's been part of the programming for the last, I would say, for sure 20, 30 years. So I'm not surprised as to why OnlyFans is becoming so big when we consider that. So the main focus is going to be on, when it comes to OnlyFans being a potential sex magic operation, is we're going to really focus on it in harvesting women's sexual energy. So we're going to imagine OnlyFans as this platform that is a generator for women's sexual energy, their generative energy, to just pour out into the world. Men's too, but we're just going to focus on women today. And there's going to be a reason for that. So what is sex magic? So sex magic is actually a very old form of magic ritual. And it goes back, it really originates in its highest point, its most meaningful point, when humanity had just essentially split genders. So initially, in the earlier epochs of the earth, the human being was something called the Adam Kadmon, which is not a physical manifestation. It's a spiritual manifestation of the human soul when it was not yet divided into male and female. So initially, the human soul is both. It's positive and negative polarity in one, right? And then when we get to actually the Lemurian epoch, or the Eden period of the earth, we have the splitting of genders into two. That's what the story of Adam and Eve is revealing. And so during the Lemurian and the Atlantean period was the high point of what is called sexual rituals and sexual magic. We can't get into all the details of that today, but suffice it to say is that was the period really where sexual magic made the most sense. And at that point, it wasn't even really about physicality. It wasn't even really about pleasure. It was something completely different than what it is today. Because again, humanity was different in those periods. We were organized differently, internally and spiritually during those periods. So really the sexual magic and the those kinds of rites are really in the lunar stream. They're really not representative of the kind of spiritual practices that are in, you could say, the right time today. It's definitely a vestige of the past when the genders just split, and there was a lot of exploration and meaning in the discovery of the two genders. So sexual rites are a carryover of ancient practices that are not really relevant to the human system because we're tuned differently. And specifically, we're no longer governed by our lower three centers. So in the time in which we were developing our lower three centers particularly, we were engaged in those kind of practices. But since that period, we are governed by the heart. And so the generative sexual energy has to be brought into the heart and purified and used and wielded with love, with God. And there has to be discernment and purification of the sexual forces today. Because it's not that sex is bad. It's that the lower centers of the human being is where we carry our trauma. It's the most dense part of ourself. And so as the energy circulates through those parts, it has to be purified through the fire of the heart. Okay, so it's not about being a prude. It's not about anything like that. It's that as the energy circulates, it has to go through a cycle of purification in the heart, or etherization in the heart. And I have a whole lecture on this called the etherization of the blood. Okay, so the energy has to flow through the body in a certain way, and this actually creates regeneration. So throw your Botox away, throw your filler away, throw the creams away, okay? If you are not using your generative energy properly, your sexual energy properly, that will age you more than anything. Okay? Because it's your generative energy, your sexual energy that is moving through those lower centers that actually rejuvenates your entire body. Okay, this is why you have sort of weird versions of this where athletes will abstain before they compete, or you'll have different occultists that talk about this, whatever. This is a reality. Okay, so you have to be very careful with your generative forces. You want to be mindful of them, and you want to attune them to God in your heart center. And you want to cycle them through properly. There's lots of different teachings, and I'm sure the comments will fill up with different conversations around that. It always it always does. So what is sexual magic used for? Okay. Sex magic is used to open portals. Okay. It's used to summon and manifest entities. It's used to manifest personal desires. And sexual forces can also be used to feed demons, to feed egregores, and in the demonic realm, they feed on human sexual energy. So anything beyond the lower centers, the demonic class doesn't really have access to. They're relegated to the lower worlds, which correspond with the lower centers of the human being. So demonic entities love to feed on the sexual energies of people. Okay, that's their food, right? And so a demonic entity that is feeding on sexual energy that is a female is called a succubus, and a male is called an incubus. And so the other thing about being careless with sexual energy is that you can draw to yourself these sort of beings as well. So angels, they don't need to feed on your sexual energy. Okay, they're not hanging around looking for that. They're self-sufficient, and any energy that we share with angels and higher beings is life and love. So it's specifically something that the lower echelons of the astral plane feed on. Now, let's get into the role of the feminine in occultism, because this is what I really want to zero in on and what I really want to focus on. Because a lot of people who look at this, they just say, oh, well, sex magic is bad, and I see people doing it, and this is sex magic. No, we have to really understand why and what is going on. So in ceremonial magic, it is the female, it is the woman who is the bridge to the spiritual world, not the man, the woman. As much as people want to confuse gender and confuse all this stuff, when it comes down to the ceremonial use of anything, it's plain as day. It is the female in any kind of ritual that forms the medium, the bridge to the spirit world. Okay? So she is the force that allows spiritual forces to enter the world. This is very clear. It's women who birth children. That is the most mundane material example of the woman as a medium for the spirit world. This is literally, you can birth a baby. It's a miracle. Your womb is a manifestation chamber. Okay. But in the magical sense, that same principle translates. So you can also bring forth spiritual entities that can use your body and that can use your forces to manifest. And so let's look at some images of different occultists actually portraying this, you could say, image of the woman as the earth, as the altar, as the force, the foundation force in which the ritual will take place. This is Anton LaVey. And here the woman is the literal altar. Now, Anton LaVey really, he sort of would dress up in costumes, and I wouldn't say he's the most serious occultist out there, but here he is using real imagery and principles that he probably got from Crowley. Okay, here's another one. This is actually a scene set up by an MI6 agent named Cecil Williamson, who was an occultist. And there you can see the woman in the same position laying down. She's forming the foundation of the ritual practice. Okay. She is the medium in which the entire occult phenomenon will manifest. Here's other examples of it. Later, it became sacrificing virgins, and it became extremely, extremely degenerate human sacrifice, because it just became about opening a portal and just getting what the people wanted in entities. But the foundation is that the medium is the woman. Okay. Here's another, this image is kind of popular. I remember seeing it a lot when people were waking up about Maria Abramovich and all these weird parties that were going on. And so this is another example of the woman as the, I would say, altar, as the foundation. Okay, and the reason why this works is that the woman is the negative polarity and she is receptive. Okay. And the male aspect, you may be wondering, is the aspect in the ritual that is the phallus. It is the positive polarity. It is the male that will then attempt to wield and sort of control what is occurring there. So the woman opens the portal, brings it through, typically, and then it's the male can wield and communicate, and sort of has this more true magician element to what he will do then. So that's why you see a lot of sex magic portrayed that way as well. And so another example of this is obviously Crowley's Scarlet Woman. Okay, this is a very ancient form of worship of occultism that Crowley reinvented, kind of a fertility rite. And then also I'm reminded of, getting into the idea of technology and occultism. I'm also reminded of Andrea Puharich, who would basically find all of these people. It wasn't just women, it was men too. But he would just leave this wake of damaged psychics that would go crazy, basically, because he was using them to open up portals and open up gates, and then he would do all these experiments on them. And a lot of people believe that Andrea Puharich was an MK Ultra doctor, and he definitely used psychics in that way, but he began inserting a lot of technology, which made people think that it was some kind of scientific feat that he was doing, when in reality, he's just practicing occultism, exploiting psychics, and then using technology, just adding technology. And don't forget also the idea of the Nephilim, and the idea that even in the Bible, there's this image that there's these spiritual entities, these fallen angels that have to enter the world through women. So they enter the world through women and they become the Nephilim. And so when it comes to esoteric science, the female plays a very, very important role, in that they are necessary for opening the veil and like letting things come through. And also the energy that women produce, as we're going to see here, is very, very needed in occult rituals. All right. So let's get very, very specific about what happens in a female medium when she is working. Okay. So women actually produce a substrate, a quasi-physical etheric substrate that forms a kind of ether, a kind of veil, if you will, in which entities can use to pass through into this world. They actually produce a substrate. Now, this certainly applies to much earlier periods, but this still does happen with different mediums. It was kind of portrayed in the Victorian era as the idea of ectoplasm. Like sometimes you would see these pictures of these mediums and they'd have like ectoplasm coming out of their ears, and then there would be like a face in the ectoplasm. It was like cheesecloth. They found out that these mediums were frauds, and they were like regurgitating cheesecloth, or they were pulling these things, like cheesecloth basically, or cloths out of themselves to make it look like it was ectoplasm. But the reality of ectoplasm is true. It actually can be produced. But unfortunately, all these frauds tried to make money and take advantage of people. And now people don't understand that there actually is a substrate that can be produced, and that acts as a medium in which entities can enter the room. Okay, so a good female psychic can build the energy up in the room, okay, change it to such a degree that entities can enter into the space, they can speak, they can appear, and that is due to the womb. Okay, so the way that women are physically set up allows this to happen. Okay, so it's through the womb and also their etheric body, and it's really through that sacral center where the sexual energy is. So the sex energy of women, the womb and the sacral chakra, is imperative for thinning the veil. It's imperative for rituals to occur. And this is why we get into this exploitation of women and women being captured in technology, is because when people become obsessed with the dark arts and technology, they want that energy. They need that energy, but they may not be able to get it normally, obviously. So this is why the feminine's always portrayed as enslaved in technology in the darkest hour of the earth, is because her generative forces, her womb, that energy is so imperative to connecting the earth with the spiritual world. So the bridge substrate that I'm talking about that is sometimes portrayed as ectoplasm has gone by different names. It was called soma ambrosia, and the metaphor for it is usually honey. Okay. There's other names as well, heavenly waters, stuff like that. But people people will say that like the ambrosia is like a mushroom, like everything is suddenly like a psychedelic drug. No, the ambrosia, the soma is referring to the Atlantean period actually, but this is the metaphor and the imagery that's carried out into our modern time. And this is actually why we see the image of the bee associated with the priestess class. So let's take a look at this here. On the left is the Omphalos stone, and that's a beehive. And that was sitting in the Temple of Apollo for the Oracle of Delphi, who was also a Melissae. So this is the high priestess's beehive because the high priestess produces the soma. She produces the honey. She produces the ectoplasm in which the room becomes filled with the masters. Spiritual. Okay. The picture in the center is the Oracle of Delphi, and she has beside her the Omphalos, which is this egg. It's a beehive actually. It could be the imagery of the egg is also very important as well. And then you have the Melissae on the lower right, and you have the bee goddess. Well, there's a reason why, especially going back into very early periods, women were associated with bees, especially the priestess class being associated with bees, is because they had to be the bridge between this world and the spirit world. That was their role. And in order to do this, you would have to be very, 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 very highly attuned. Okay. So you don't want to default into the horror energy, right? You have to be attuned to Christ. And that allows that substrate to be pure. And then you can bring forth incredible spiritual insight, and it can work positively. This happens in every human being, by the way. It's just how our bodies, our etheric body receives the images and energy portrayed through the spiritual world. We call that psychic perception. But you could also be built up in a ceremonial way to project your etheric body, essentially, and the condition of your etheric body into the room. And this is called the soma. And this would be high magic. And so this also happens in very dark brotherhoods, very dark situations where obviously the energy of sex, that generative womb energy, is used so that you could say dark occultists can bring in the lowest things possible, right? So what does this have to do with OnlyFans? I'm sure that you could maybe put things together a little bit, knowing what we've just discussed. Well, if you create, allegedly, not saying that they're doing this, I'm just saying hypothetically, if you were to create a website and then encourage not just women, it's other people too, but really the women to pour their sexual energy out into the world in a constant stream, then whoever has created that, their subsidiaries, would be able to have authority over all of that energy. Because it's their symbols, it's underneath their symbol, it's underneath their name. So allegedly, hypothetically, I'm not saying it's happening, but you could technically harness all of that and use that in magical rites, because technology is allowing this to happen en masse. And all of this, why are we doing this as women? You know, why are we so hypersexualized? Why are we being told that it's liberating to not at all consider what our sexual energy is? To just treat it like it's nothing. All that happens is it gets poured out and poured out and poured out into the world carelessly, and it goes into this pool that could really be used. Okay, this is the era and the time where we are supposed to refine this energy. Okay, and I want to show you one more photo. You've probably seen it actually. This is a photo of Maria Abramovich and Lady Gaga. A lot of these photos were going around, I think, in maybe 2016 or so. And this is actually a naked woman, and she's covered in honey. And the picture, the ceremony was part of a New York, like kind of a New York installment. And there was Hugh Jackman was there, and there were all these celebrities that were participating in this, and it was incredibly occult. This is the first one that you went into, was a woman covered in honey, and people were eating it. And this is the thing that I was trying to convey in the last episode of Occulted, is that usually when dark occultists will use this imagery, it's very obvious. They're like, oh, the bee goddess, let's just have a woman laying in honey and then that'll set it off. You know, so that's a very obvious image of this. And so, again, I'm going to say this again. It is not ethical to participate to have people participate in occult rituals without telling them. When you do that, it's for one thing, and that's for harvesting energy and directing attention. It's for power. Right? So, in order to thin the veil, you want to communicate with something out there, you have to use women's generative forces. Women are the vehicle between this world and the next. That's why Isis is portrayed as veiled. She is behind the veil. That's why the high priestess in tarot sits between the two pillars of here and there, of material world and non-material world. It's the women's generative sex forces that are used as the basis of magic. And when you're not wielding them consciously, someone can get a hold of those, what you're spilling forth in this world as a magician or in the demonic plane, and start using and feeding on that. And I'm not trying to produce fear. It's just that we have to understand the reality of the energy body. Okay. This isn't about, shaming people. People can do what they want. But if your energy operates in a certain way and it's channeled through your body and has certain ways in which it operates that is beneficial, then people should know that. Because right now the world thinks that the spirit world doesn't exist, that there is no energy channels in your body at all. The chakra system isn't real, and it is. And in order to become a conscious participant in your own body and with your own energy, you have to know how it works. Your generative energy, your sexual energy, is the same energy that's going to regenerate your body, heal your body. It's what connects you to the spirit world too. This is our life energy. So how do you want to use it? That's how we need to think about things. So I want to make it clear that we've been discussing technology a lot, and that technology can sort of contain these different entities. But that starts to really amp up when you start to add in this generative energy. Okay. And the reason why I featured Epstein and Diddy on this thumbnail is because at this point, I think it's important that when we look at these celebrity sex scandals where there's, trafficking and all this sort of stuff going on and these weird orgies, we have to start considering whether what we're talking about today is part of that and understanding the occultism behind this, what an orgy does. Okay, so what an orgy does, and this is why they would have massive orgies with fertility cults, is because if you have a bunch of people in one room and they're having sex, that's creating a basically massive bubble in which spirit can enter. Okay? That's also producing energy in which certain entities can feed. Because it's that energy that is life. It's the substrate of life. Okay? And I really want to close on this one concept as well, which is that the female bioenergetic field is different than the male bioenergetic field. So men have a different arrangement in their energy body than women do. So men have a positively charged physical body, a negatively charged etheric body, and there's an alternation of polarity as you go up the spiritual bodies. And women have the opposite arrangement. And so women's bioenergetic field is different than men's and can be used particularly in an exploitive way with technology. And that's where we get this image. This is the precog from Minority Report. And when transhumanism gets out of control, the woman, the female, is always trapped in the machine. She's always reduced to her most basic functions, which is reproduction and psychic mediumship, thinning the veil. That image of Minority Report is the spiritual exploitation of women, which actually is possible. And it seems so far away. It seems so bizarre. But we have to start thinking about that. So you really could have an environment where you have like dark magicians that use people like slaves to produce sexual energy that they can just use. So women become generators in particular because of their ability to produce life. They become generators in a technological dystopia, potentially. And I want to also close out and read this one passage from Thomas Burgoyne's The Light of Egypt. Okay. That discusses the relationship between the masculine and feminine in the occult, in the spiritual world, and how when the male aspect is fallen, when it's not properly attuned, when it's darkened, okay, when it's evil, it can actually absorb into it and consume its feminine aspect. And this is a sign of supreme evil. So when the male consciousness is not properly attuned, and when it's technically satanic, it can become so poorly directed that it actually absorbs into it its own feminine aspect and destroys it and uses it to feed on itself. Okay. So this is from page 30, and it is a note. And it says, the masculine and feminine attributes of the soul cannot be destroyed as a whole. But the masculine portion may attract its feminine portion or soulmate, and by the intense selfhood of its own dominant forces, virtually destroy her manifested existence. This absorption, however, is a very rare occurrence and only transpires in the case of those magical adepts of the astral plane who have attained their psychological powers by complete polarization of all the truly human elements of their internal natures. Such magical adepts become the concentrated centers of spiritual selfishness, but teach the external masses that self is the very demon they have conquered. These occult processes have transformed them into sexless beings who are neither human nor divine, and yet they profess to be the guardians of the secret doctrine, the secret science. In this latter capacity, they have formulated much erroneous philosophy, since they are self-magnetized and self-deluded by their own positive idea of nature to such an extent they cannot penetrate beyond their own astral spheres, nor receive any knowledge which elevates the soul to higher views and truer conceptions of God's infinite resources. It is from this magical school of thought that mankind have received the doctrines which teach that sex is only the appearance of matter and not a spiritual reality, whereas nothing in this mighty universe is so manifest and so eternal as the male and female expressions of the divine soul. These adepts profess to have blended the two, but they have simply polarized the feminine and created a conscious selfhood of the other. So what Thomas is saying here, and I understand, this is from the 1800s, but what Thomas is really saying here is that the masculine aspect of the consciousness can actually become so deluded and so selfish and so self-oriented. It can glorify the self, try to absorb into its being its own feminine aspect, devour it, and then it envisions itself as a sexless being. And it becomes destroyed, essentially. But the masculine portion may attract its feminine portion, and by the intense selfhood of its own dominant forces, virtually destroy her manifested existence. This is when the masculine impulse in society becomes so selfish and so self-oriented, right, that it devours the feminine impulse and uses it as a mechanism and machine for its own forwardness, its own ability to experience itself. And that occult process transforms them into sexless beings who are neither human nor divine. And yet they profess to be the guardians of the secret doctrine, the secret science. So that is something that would cause an angel to fall, for sure. So again, that is, I'll put it in the description, but it's called The Light of Egypt, The Science of the Soul and Stars by Thomas H. Burgoyne. This is in the first volume. This is on page 30, actually. And that chapter is on just basically polarity in occultism. And it's just, when I first came across that years ago, it was in the middle of the pronoun conversation and this hardcore movement in society to basically remove polarity altogether, to remove gender altogether. And to me, that looks like exactly what this writer was talking about 100 years ago. All right, you guys, let's see what you have to say. All right, let's see what your comments are. Shri, love from India. Hello. So this one is from Omnifus Productions. Lots of disturbing symbolism and anti-human rhetoric coming from the mainstream media. Yeah, it is disturbing. It really does. Like when I was doing some research for this episode and you guys were just sending me so many of these images, I really started to think that part of getting to a certain place in culture requires you to portray yourself as certain characters. You just can't, I really do believe that that's reality, that that's true, because you can't go and look at these concerts. And I mean, they're wanting you to see them as the modern whore of Babylon. And it's trying to draw us into this transhuman, hyper-technological age. And if we begin talking about it now, we can do what the other commenter said and, develop technology properly without worshiping it in this way, without constantly showing people. And by the way, it's not just women that are portrayed as robots and stuff like that. It's just that when we're dealing with the idea of a new Eve, and you look at the idea of the Whore of Babylon kind of symbolizing that, a kind of like a dark Eve, a dark lower earth forming with this higher earth, and that is what the symbol of that lower earth is a silicon earth, or a earth that is made of the dross of this one. And if we are to fall into a technological dystopia, like so many science fiction writers have predicted, then that's exactly what you would choose as a symbol. You would choose a female enslaved in a machine. That's the earth electrified. That's the earth completely controlled through technology. Every aspect of nature has to be, a machine has to be involved now. It's an overdevelopment. We're in a place of overdevelopment at this point. Okay, Alex, I once had an OBE and Grays telepathically came to me and said, evolve, evolve, evolve. And their energy was gross. Yeah, the Grays are a fascinating rabbit hole to go down. There's so much to touch with that one there. But the Grays, people have these experiences where all kinds of different sorts of abduction experiences. And whenever they're with Grays, there's always this weird technological element to it. And also with these insect beings that people experience as well, it's sort of like they get abducted and they have like a sit down with these things, and they tell them that you have to give me your genetic information. You have to go through this hybridization program. Technology is the future. You have to merge with machines. You can have healing technology. Look at this ship you can have. You're going to be part of this galactic federation. And it all is this weird spiritualization of transhumanism. So much of the starseed movement and the alien movement is the spiritualizing of technology. There's no way around it. You look where it goes, and that's where it goes. And I've had so many people write me and say very similar things. Like, we're going to land and have first contact, and we're going to give you all of this technology. It's just bizarre, quite frankly. Okay, this is from Nadera for Trump. This is a spiritual portal to Earth School. Yeah, exactly. Existence 130, thanks for sharing your wisdom on this. Very much needed in our times. Jeffrey Tugas, the devil forces no one. He uses their own indiscretions against them. Yeah, this is one of the best images of Satan that I have seen, or that I always go back to, is the image of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where Gene Wilder is actually playing Lucifer, or he's playing the satanic figure. And he doesn't tell you to go and indulge in the chocolate river and the whatever it is. He's just like, look at this, look at this, look at this. And then at the end of the day, you're on some weird boat and the lights are flashing and it's crazy and it just turns into a nightmare and you turn into a blueberry and it's just, you end up destroying yourself, right? But he doesn't make you do it. It's our own lower impulses that drive us to our own destruction. And Satanists know this. Satanists know that in a culture that is spiritually ignorant, that all they have to do is be Willy Wonka and show people things and say, isn't this great? And appeal to their lower urges and tell them it's fine or whatever it is. And it's like taking candy from a baby until we wake up and we actually understand the objective reality of what is happening to our energy when we engage in these things, to our mind when we engage in these things, and what it does to the collective consciousness as well. We wonder, why is the world going to hell in a handbasket? Well, we've been engaging with basically black magic symbols for decades. You know, people adore these pop stars. They can't see them as doing anything wrong. They love people. Hollywood is kind of falling from grace, but Hollywood is a big offender as well. So remember, I bet you will trigger some people with this stream, but it's highly needed. Yeah, I think it will. And that's fine. That's fine. I think that we have a very poor image of the feminine right now. And I think it needs to be healed. And I think part of that is understanding the sexual force of the human being. It's been, I mean, people don't even know or realize that sexual forces are magical forces. People are engaging in things that they would probably never do if they actually understood what their generative forces are. And they're being told, it just so happens that they're being told to spill these forces all the time into the ethers, to not use them properly, to not use their will with them. If that offends people, that's fine. But it shouldn't. Because there is an objective way in which your energy works in your body. And we have been lied to. All of us have been lied to about how that is. There's a reason why we have a culture all of a sudden that encourages everyone to just be hypersexual all the time. Because it creates this spiritual energy that can be harnessed and used by occultists. When we start actually commanding and generating our own energy properly, it becomes hard to manipulate you, if not impossible. All right. Rebel Sun 88. There's no earthly way of knowing which direction we are going. Well, you can definitely control where you're going. You can definitely control the thoughts that you think and the material that you engage in, who you support, what you support. The world is going to do what the world is going to do, but you have agency and control over your life. And as we started out this talk today, there's two paths. There's always a bifurcation of a planetary sphere in its life. It has a lower aspect that forms, which is the dross, and a higher aspect that forms, which we know as New Jerusalem. And we choose that path. It doesn't matter what anybody else is doing because you're choosing that path with how you're using your mind and heart every single day. It doesn't matter. You're in charge of that. You're in charge with what you align with, right? It's not a collective experience when it comes to the end cycle of this planet. It is you follow the track that you have placed yourself on, right? All right. And the last question is, society is being Willy Wonkified. Yes, I agree. We are being Willy Wonkified. Oh, there's a couple more coming in. The society is being Willy Wonkified. We're given all of the things we could possibly want to indulge, all of this food, technology is making it easier than ever to just be entertained all the time. And this is the period in which we have to become more disciplined, more aware, more conscious, and have a place for all these things in our life, but not be consumed by the culture. Have it so you can enter into it and that you can leave, that you can be in the world, but not of it, right? Buy a floor. I see women's capacity for empathy being hijacked. So many women are aligning their sense of empathy with movements that seek to destroy and manipulate women and the feminine. Yeah, exactly. It's a misuse of empathy. It's toxic empathy. And it is very obvious when we look at like fourth wave feminism, which is nothing like the first wave of feminism at all. You literally see in these later stages of feminism, you literally see women gathering together and rallying for, the idea of there being no gender at all. There's no objective gender anymore. This destroys feminism. It destroys women. It destroys men. It's a caricature of itself at this point. And it's very obvious that the dissolution of polarity, the dissolution of gender to not having objective sex anymore, it's very difficult. It's very easy to see from the level of the occult that is to bring in transhumanism. And transhumanism is the inverted male Mars impulse. That's what it stems from, which leads to women literally being enslaved in the ways that we've talked about today more than anything. Ironically, it is the Christ impulse, which so many people fear and have a weird idea about because they went to church one day and didn't like the pastor, or they had a repressive childhood and have a bad idea about Christianity. It's like, that's not Christ. That's a bad experience. That's a false perception that you have. And that drives people into very negative spiritual things because they have a poor conception of what the Christ really is. And there absolutely is a space for the feminine in Christ. We can, read it again, which is the feminine is the Sophia of Christ, the wisdom of Christ. There's a place for you here. And this is the time and the era in which it has to emerge, which is why we're seeing all of this weird imagery. It's time for Sophia, true Sophia, to come forward. Bruce Key, isn't this the great challenge, though? Isn't this set up to allow only those who search for answers to rise above? I believe it's for a purpose, but not a dark purpose. This is the great challenge, though. It's actually easier than ever to find information. Back in the day, even 150 years ago, even 50 years ago, if you really wanted to understand something, really wanted to learn something, you would have had to take classes. The information was probably limited. You'd have to spend a great deal of time getting books out, looking through books. The way that we can learn now through technology is incredible. And that's the positive side. So a lot of phenomenal resources are there for people who genuinely are going to challenge themselves, who genuinely want to understand. But at the same time, the other path is pure decadence. And as I mentioned earlier, in prior earthly eras, decadence was symbolized as animalism, as the beast, as the woman riding the beast, as the beast, the lower impulses completely controlling her, no refinement of the lower centers at all. Now, the beast is technology. Now, the beast in decadence is allowing a machine to do your laundry. That's decadence. Allowing a machine to do your thinking and seeing for you. That's a kind of decadence. Technology now represents the decadence that animalism represented prior. And that's why the whore in modern times is portrayed as a machine. All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining me today. If you do have a tip, you can send that to me through ggyoung.com/occulted, and I will be right back here very shortly with some more episodes as soon as I can see what you want to talk about. And I will leave you guys to the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.